I'd like to welcome you to African Philosophy Conversations today. My guest is Dr. Edwin Etieyibo. He is a philosopher, professor of philosophy at University of the Witswatersrand, or as we know it, Wits. He has his PhD from University of Alberta in Edmonton, where I'm speaking to him right now. He is from Nigeria originally. He's started in looking at English literature, excuse me, English literature as well as philosophy. And so thank you so much, Dr. Etieyibo, for being in this conversation with me today.
Thank you, Bruce, for inviting me. This is very exciting. And as we spoke earlier, this is quite a useful pedagogical way of trying to connect all of us and see how we are doing in philosophy and African philosophy. Right. And I wish we can do more of this. That will enrich the discipline and the field. So thank you very much for blazing the trail and for pointing us to what we should be thinking of and how we should be looking at doing some philosophy in terms of philosophy, African philosophy conversations.
So I'd like to start this with the question I start all of these conversations with, which is really just asking you how you found your way into philosophy in general and into African philosophy in particular.
Yeah, that's a question I haven't really thought much about recently. But it's a long story. I'll try and make it as short as I can. I mean, I'm not one of those who got into philosophy because I chose that as my discipline. In fact, prior to my doing philosophy at the University of Lagos in 1994, where I got in, and then I graduated in 1998, I haven't really considered much about philosophy. I have read a bit about philosophy, just the little you read here and there. But often than not, it's within a negative sort of connotation. People usually say, oh, those who do philosophy they don't believe in God, right? The atheists, stay away from philosophy because you will just lose every of your sanity and all that, So that's the most I kind of picked up for philosophy. But then it's strange that I ended up doing philosophy, even though that seemed to be the way in which people understand philosophy and the way in which the little thing I really have done suggest that as well. Anyway, so I applied to the University of Lagos to read initially law. So I applied actually a year before. So in Nigeria, they have this education system where you finish high school and you can get distinction in all of your high school subjects, but that does not qualify you to take any course in the university. You have to do an entrance examination that is administered by a body called JAM, a Joint Admission Matriculation Board. So they set the exam and you do four subjects. Each subject is 100. And then each university then set what they call a cutoff mark based on the number of students they want to admit. They have all kinds of other lists. They have the merit list, they have discretionary lists, they have all that sort of list, sports lists and all that. And so they set the cutoff mark, and if you meet it, you're automatically admitted. If you don't, you then either you hope you get into the other list, discretionary or other list. So when I applied for law, the first time I did the exam, the cutoff point for law for University of Lagos, by the way, the cutoff point for usually law, medicine, these two disciplines, it's also in probably some engineering, they are usually very, very high. In fact, the highest usually in almost any universities in Nigeria. And for you to get into those programs, you really have to do astoundingly well. So I missed the cutoff point by 2. The cutoff point for law for that year was 295, and I scored 293. So I thought, oh, yeah, 293, it's close by. I might make the discretionary list. So I was hoping, I was waiting, and I didn't make it until they matriculated. And by the time I realized that I literally will not be going to university that year, I was already late to apply for the next entrance examination. So it was difficult. I had to go to the office, plead with them. Somehow they gave me a form. I filled it right in the office. I submitted it. You know, the exam was take place about 2 months after then. And eventually I did the exam, but that was where the mistake occurred. So for that entrance exam, I actually did better. I actually then made the cutoff point. The cutoff point for the year 1994 was 298, and I had 302. So I was excited. Oh, goodness me, I'm going to read law. Then we started, the university opened, and we were to register, you know. So I went to the university. I like, okay, I want to register. And they looked at my score. They're like, oh, this is fantastic, you know. Well, they looked at my high school subjects. Oh, this is fantastic. But then they said, but we can't register you. I said, why? They said, because you did not do one of the required subjects you have to do in JAM is literature, English literature. I'm like, yeah, but that was not there. I mean, when I did it 2 years ago, there was no English literature. They're like, yes, they changed it just this year. I'm like, oh, goodness me. And I didn't have a chance to look at that because I filled this form in the office, right? You know, and English literature was one of my best subjects, even in high school. I mean, I would have passed easily, right? You know?
Yeah.
So I thought they were joking. They're like, no, you didn't meet the requirement, you know, which that's one of the requirement. We'll take you to philosophy. That was how I landed in philosophy. You know, of course, very unhappy, grumpy, you know, and just punching everything on my way, you know.
That's usually not how we like to have philosophy majors come into the subject.
I know, which is when I tell my students this, they're like, they should have kicked you out of philosophy. I'm like, no, I'm here to stay now. So I ended up in philosophy, and I said, okay, well, maybe I'll do it for a year and I'll see if I can transfer to a different program, you know. And then the first semester was mind-blowing. Was wow, you know, and one of the subjects that actually, there are two subjects that actually kind of hooked me into philosophy. One was ancient Greek philosophy. We did the Pythagoras, Anaximander, Thales, and all that. Then the other was ancient African philosophy.
Oh, wow.
So I had the opportunity to compare both, to say, wow, this is interesting. And philosophy on its own is just, this is a discipline where there are more questions than answers. This is interesting. Even the answers become questions after all, right? You know, you have the answers and then they become further questions. There's almost no end to questioning. I'm like, this is where one should be, you know. And I just not from there look back. I said, no, philosophy is where I'm going to be, and so that is the part about what got me into philosophy.
Well, that's a really interesting trajectory. I mean, you know, I got into philosophy pretty early on. I knew I wanted to be in philosophy, and at one point I thought, well, you know, maybe I have to get a job sometime, so maybe I should do law. And so I started looking into law, and then I asked myself, what areas of law would I be interested in? Well, I'd be interested in, you know, international law, and I'd be interested in legal theory. And I realized, you know, all I want to do is philosophy in a different guise, you know, because those are all basically the most theoretical areas of law.
That's true.
So why don't I just do philosophy if I want to do philosophy? And so then it was like, you know, okay, it's going to be philosophy. But you know, you ended up doing a law degree anyway, didn't you? In South
Africa?
I did. Is that correct?
I did.
Yeah.
Yes, at the University of South Africa,
right.
2013 to 2017, which I did, yeah, for 4 years, yeah. Yeah.
So you had the best of both worlds then.
Yes. And interestingly, when I was doing it, people thought, oh, maybe he's going to go to law, he's leaving philosophy. I said, no, I will never leave philosophy. I will never leave the academy. In fact, the reason I'm doing law was because I told some of my lecturers at University of South Africa that the reason I'm doing it is because I want to be able to qualify as a lawyer so that I can handle my own matters. And then all the injustices I'm suffering from police, from institutions, from establishment, I can fight them and sue them on my own without having to worry about legal costs. The guy looked at me and said, this is the first time I'm hearing somebody give this reason as to why they are doing law. I said, yes, because I'm a philosopher.
So you have a kind of practical side as well as a theoretical side to
Yes.
your background, which is really fascinating. I mean, I hear so many people come into philosophy. The paths are just as different as you can imagine. But
Yes.
in your case, was quite fascinating because it was a kind of disappointment at the beginning, and then
Yes.
it hooked you, which is great.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
So
And the disappointment is like a blessing, because imagine if that had not happened, I would have ended up in law. I would probably have been a very frustrated lawyer, because I have a lot of lawyers in my family, and I don't think they're as happy with what they do. My immediate older brother is a lawyer. My niece and nephews are lawyers. I have cousins all over the place that are
yeah,
lawyers. I have lawyers all over the place. And they kind of envy me now. They're like, wow, you are having a great career. I'm like, yes, I would have been like you guys lawyers, but so
yeah.
I'm happy with that disappointment. So people sometimes say every disappointment is a blessing. I say, well, that is certainly true in my own case, this
Yeah.
case.
Well, so I want to get into some things, I guess, that are implied by the kind of path that you took in. And I guess the place I want to start is with this book that you edited a number of years ago, and it came out of a conference, I believe, about 5 or 6 years ago.
Right.
And it's such a fascinating book because you're interested in method in philosophy in general and African philosophy in particular. And so I guess I'd like you to just talk a little bit about how you think about method in philosophy and especially in African philosophy. I mean, some people might think that, when you're thinking about, let's say, the social sciences, well, the methods are, the research that you go into the field to do. You do surveys, or you do participant research, or you do this or that, and all of it is meant to kind of get to a kind of theoretical level. So you could do those various methods of research in order to support, let's say, a functionalist approach in anthropology, or a certain theory in psychology, or something like that. So how do you conceive, or how do you think about method in philosophy, and in particular in African philosophy?
Yeah, good. That's a very good question. I think the number of issues that drove me into thinking about methods in African philosophy, as you rightly remarked, about the book, which is the product of the conference we had in 2015. One of those is, this would go way back, and as you know, when the debate about whether African philosophy existed or not, the metaphilosophical question, one of the core issues that was in the front burner when this issue was there in the 70s, 80s, was if there's African philosophy, what is it, right? And so what part of the discussion is about, for us to be able to understand what it is, we have to understand whether the way African philosophy is presented or done is similar to the way it is understood in the West, for example, right? And so the question becomes, so what is the method of philosophy as understood in the Western tradition? And then, of course, once you begin to talk about it and talk about what philosophy entails, then you divide people into different camps. Some people now say, well, there's no African philosophy because you don't have those sort of things present in African philosophy. Some begin to say, well, no, that the method in African philosophy is different because it uses X, Y, Z. So you had those. That's one of the issue that sort of that I was interested in. But I think of more recent, the one that actually kind of pushed me was the sort of, and I probably may talk about this later on, was there is a kind of a conversation, I'll call it a conversation, not to render it in a way that is positive, between, although they may not see it as conversation, between Thaddeus Metz and Mogobe Ramose.
Right.
So Metz presents African ethics, Ubuntu, African moral theory, in terms of trying to present it in the street analytic method, right? Where you would sort of kind of bring out the principle of moral theory, and then show how that can be used to guide actions.
Right.
And Ramose simply says, that is just wrong about Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a lived philosophy. It's a lived experience. It's not susceptible to that any sort of method. It's not something, it's embedded, permits the entire life histories of the Africans. So it's not something you have a method that you then pull out these rules or principles and then like a top-down approach, and then you then use it to decide what actions are moral or not. You know, that you are bringing in your sort of Western understanding of how philosophy is to Ubuntu, which resists that kind of. So then the question before me was that, okay, where if Ubuntu, for example, does that suggest therefore that there's no method, there can't be method, even in trying to unpack Ubuntu, for example? And then there'll be other debates that were coming up that I have had the opportunity to review papers, you know, and you know, people were saying, no, African philosophy should stay closely to the hermeneutical method. No, African philosophy is about language analysis, linguistic analysis, and you see somebody like Barry Halley, for example, you know, pushing this idea. And in terms of hermeneutic, you see people like Oye pushing that that sort of idea. And so you have this sort of. So I said, okay, well, firstly, let's answer the question. Ask the question: is method? What is method? And is this still something that we need to put on the table to talk about, given how many years we've been talking about African philosophy? So the first thing I wanted to find out was what method. I mean, and what I wanted to do in that book was to simply say, well, I don't think that to say that there is a particular method to African philosophy is very simplistic. Philosophy is experience of relating to the world, engaging with the world. The philosophy there is no one particular method of answering questions, of engaging with the world, of engaging with your experiences. What matter is at the end of the day, you are engaging some sort of systematic engagement with experience, whether universal experience, particular experience, in a particular place you find yourself, and you are making sense of this in the global context of humans and all that. That is for me, so that was part of the motivation to say, anybody who thinks there's one method of philosophy or African philosophy, I think the person is mistaken. I think there are plurality of methods, and any of these methods, whatever they are, as long as they get to what we think about philosophy as a love of wisdom, that for me sufficiently does the job.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I've sometimes made the distinction between what I call a mode of thought and a space of thought. You know, and so a mode of thought would be like an individual method, but you know, what we call a philosophy, whether it's Western or African or Chinese or whatever, is really a space of thought in which there is a multiplicity of ways of creating concepts, of ways of deploying methods, of ways of all sorts of different things. And what happens at those edges of all of that is really part of that creative space in which a thought can emerge. I mean, I think of Emmanuel Eze's last book on reason as really a kind of nice kind of statement on this, because Eze, you know, really tries to kind of cash out a number of ways that we think about reason, and then talks about rationality as a different kind of strategies for deploying those modes of reason. And so it's always about creating a space in which thought is possible.
Right. Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think the distinction between reason and rationality, as it makes, is quite very important. It allows us to be able to make this sort of case of different ways of which would be the rationality, as you point out, and reason is shared universally, you know, and it's what one thing that defines philosophy in a way is the mode as you present it. You know, and for me, so what I wanted to also accomplish in that book was to point out the fact that part of the error people make is they sort of, as you put it, they equate the space for the mode, right? You know, and sometimes the mode for the space. And once we're clear about what is philosophical, and then the different ways of doing philosophy, which would be the space, then we are able to understand that there's no one particular way of experience or of engaging with experience.
Well, so I guess I'd like you to think about all of that in the context of ethics, which is really one of your major kind of substantive areas of research. You've written extensively on ethics. Obviously, we use the term ethics around the world in all sorts of different spaces of thought, all sorts of different traditions, all of that sort of thing. So when you think of ethics in an African context, is there something that makes it unique? Is that even the right question to be asking? Should we be asking questions about uniqueness to Africa, or is it a different kind of conversation that we should be having about ethics within an African space?
Wonderful question. This question reminds me, and one way I sort of want to think about this question, to think about it in terms of Kwasi Wiredu's idea of universalism and particularism, right? So one might say the particularism part is what is unique, and the universalism part is what makes it share the same features with whatever philosophy or ethics is anywhere around the world. So for example, you talk about ethics, you talk about ethical theory, and the prominent ethical theory people talk about would be utilitarianism and deontology, maybe virtue ethics and all that. And people who do African ethics say, well, we can find strands of this also in African ethics, right? We can, in fact, if you read Kwasi Jeshe article, African Ethics in the Sanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it does start by suggesting African ethics has a character base, and all that. It points towards some idea of virtue ethics there, and people interpret Ubuntu sometimes in terms of virtue ethics, some in terms of deontology, so all these elements are out there, But what it shares, what African ethics share with ethics generally, as we understand it, is that in general, ethics is concerned with, if we're thinking about ethics that encompass three branches: meta-ethics, normative ethics, applied ethics. But often when people talk about ethics, they focus on normative ethics, which is it's the guy's action. It's a branch of ethics that enables us to think critically about what sort of persons we want to be and the kind of actions or behavior that are morally acceptable and all that in a given community. And that is that is the universalism part that African ethics itself, African ethics also is understood in that sense of providing us a way of thinking about our moral lives, how we can be better persons, for example. To what end morality should be directed to? Is it the community, the individual, and all that? But there are parts that are unique that makes the particularism aspects pronounced, so as Wiredu talked about, universalism and particularism. So ultimately, as we know that philosophy is philosophizing from some place, Thomas Nagel has reminded us there's no view from nowhere. Right. If every view is a particular view, you start from the particular, and you then might extend it to the universal, and then you find out that, wow, okay, this is the same with all over the place, right? So even when philosophers try to universalize concept and say it's universal, they start from a particular place, from that particular experience, from a cultural point of view, right? And that's why your book, I think, is very instrumental, very critical for African philosophy, because it's about philosophy in an African place, right? And really pulls the point quite clearly, which is to say, you don't have any philosophy of no place, right? And so to talk about the way in which African ethics are. So again, look at the debate between Ramose and Med. Ramose wants to say, for the African, ethics is not abstract, rule-based way of thinking of behavior, right? Is embedded in the cultural beliefs, in the relationship in the community, in the ideas and other kinds of things. It's a lived experience among the people. That is quite a bit unique. It's different from the way in which people think about ethics like utilitarianism or ontology or counter-ethics in the Western tradition, right? So what I would like to see is some kind of, how do we make sense of this philosophy of place, particularism, And how can other traditions benefit from an ethics that is embedded, an ethics that is ethics of lived experience, that is not in the language of Rosalind Rochas, it's not the ethics that comes from the top, from God or something for us, right? You know, and I don't think much more people haven't really engaged in this sufficiently, and they haven't taken part of the cue from JH's article of the sense in which we can think of ethics as lived experience, as embedded in the cultural tradition, in the beliefs, and live in the relationship, and then put it in the context of where those particularism and universalism, and say, what can Western ethics learn from African ethics, for example?
Okay, well, I mean, there's a bunch of paths I would like to, follow up on that, but I think where I'll go with this is another part of your work, which is contractarianism, and I'm wondering how or if that fits into what you just said, how that works in that context. I mean, I know, that has deep roots within, Western liberal theory. I know you worked on David Gautier. I know your external reader on your dissertation was Jan Narveson, who was a professor of mine back at Waterloo. We agreed on almost nothing. But I like Jan. I mean, he was great. And so contractarianism has such deep roots within that kind of liberal discourse, which I see, it seems like on the surface a difficult fit into an African context. And so I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit and see how, if it fits, does it fit? Does it not fit? What do we have to do to make it fit?
No, Bruce, you're looking for trouble, but they've good trouble. Because you are actually the first that has pushed me in that direction. I've thought about it a bit, but I haven't really tried to make a solid case for it. And it does seem like, my career, both, like you can pass out my career into two. You can say, when I went to Canada, I did my PhD, I worked on contractarianism, had almost nothing with African philosophy, save the few times I had to teach African ethics in an ethics course I was teaching, right? And there was, I did no African philosophy course. The 12 courses I did at the University of Alberta, there was no African philosophy. And then I go to South Africa and I start doing African philosophy, and there's like no meeting point between this. But then in a sense, you are like asking me, is there a meeting point, right?
Exactly.
And I think it's a good question to ask. Yeah, that's why I say you're looking for trouble, but
there might not be, and it's okay if there isn't. But
no, I think they are. I think they are. I would say why I think they are and how I think that there are connections. And the only time I've tried to write a bit about stuff that connects some sort of African philosophy with contractarianism was a book I edited on perspective in social contract theory, which was published recently as well. And there's a chapter there that I co-authored with Antonio Yowe. It's called Ubuntu and Contractarianism. So in that book, I tried to show in what sense you can make a case for Ubuntu and its relationship to contractarianism. But I did a poor job in that chapter. I didn't do a sufficiently good job. And since then I thought about, but nobody has pushed me. Now you're pushing me, so I now need to really think more deeply about this. But here's why I think, and because you're pushing me, I actually now started thinking that the next talk I was going to give in the philosophy department at VIT, which should be sometime in March, I will give a talk on this because of this, just to develop some of the ideas.
Okay, well, as long as you footnote me then.
Yes, I would, because you're giving me a challenge, right? So I think about some of the connections. So you're right that contractarianism had very deep root in liberal theory, in liberalism, and it does seem that it's not a fit for African philosophy or African ethics that you talk more about as communalistic, communalism or communitarianism and all that, which are almost in a sense some parallels or opposites and all that. But there is a debate that has been going on between what people call radical communitarianism and moderate communitarianism. And I think one of the central point that divides them is moderate communitarianism wants to find a space for communitarianism for the individual, right? You know, because they think radical communitarianism just run as according to using the word of Kwasi Wiredu, runs roughshod over the individual, right? You know, but moderate communitarianism will accommodate the individual, will allow for the individual space in the sort of a communitarian framework. And of course, people say, but ultimately at the end of the day, moderate communitarianism turns out to be radical communitarianism if you push you too far, because when there is a tension or disagreement between the individual and community, moderate communitarianism will say where the community takes precedence. Once you say that, you have become radical communitarian, right? You know, and all that. Anyway, so yeah, I think this idea of contractarianism would probably, hopefully, will solve this. That is my initial thinking here, is to say for contractarianism, what is key is, and by the way, Gautier was, I think, is one of the most sophisticated social contract theorists, as I did argue in my PhD thesis, because he is the first that brought together, because contractarianism or social contract theory is often discussed only in terms of political philosophy. But Gautier tried to make a case for how morality and political philosophy and economics all merge together, right? You know, so his book, his 1986 book, Morals by Agreement, was simply to say morality, ethics is nothing over and above some kind of agreement, right? You know, it's not just some kind of political norms, it's also moral norms that are generated from our social convention, right, and all that. So, but the key point about contractarianism is that the test of whether a particular moral norm or political norm or some obligations that are imposed on individuals, the test case as to whether they are legitimate, acceptable, would be to say, would they be sanctioned by the rational agent that is understood to possess a degree of rationality? So the simple idea is to say, if you have some moral obligations, political obligations, and you say, these are binding on you, the question would be, would an individual who reasons and says, well, these are sort of norms I would have adopted, or I would rationally, hypothetically adopt under given appropriate given conditions, right? You know, if the answer is yes, then you have answered the question. So the social contract theory, it is not about actual agreement that is the issue, it's hypothetical agreement. It's agreement that people would hypothetically enter into if they possess rational faculties sufficiently in appropriate conditions, right? So here is how it solves, I think it will solve the problem of moderate communitarianism and radical communitarianism. The issue will be because the problem for moderate communitarianism is to say, well, communities can't tell individual what to do. That's just wrong, right? You know, the question would be where it's not just because it's coming from the community that's the issue. The question should be, would these norms, as Menkiti presents it, to say where a personhood is formed, or in a way is the community is responsible in some sense as a catalyst in making the person, right? You know, and the modern communitarians will say, well, no, I won't accept that because that's radical communitarianism. But that should not be the response. The response should be, are these norms that issue from the community the ones that any rational agent would accept? Right. Well, so that opens up the space to be able to allow for modern communitarianism and radical communitarianism to, if you want to argue for both, to make a case. That's part of why I think you can make use of contractarianism. Yeah, no, I mean, that's certainly plausible. And you know, I look forward to hearing your talk where you work that out a little bit more. I mean, it strikes me that, you know, contractarianism in a certain sense is an attempt to solve a problem that's presented by, you know, a kind of an assumption of liberalism, which is the assumption of individuality, right? So the question is, how do we trust each other? Is there any mechanism by which we can trust each other? And you know, something like Ubuntu, especially Ramosa's version of it, seems to me to start in a very different place. And I think we sometimes misunderstand Ubuntu to think, you know, that it's kind of the mirror side, the other side from individualism. So whereas, you know, the West, you know, prioritizes the individual over the community, Ubuntu prioritizes the community over the individual. And I think that's a misrepresentation to some extent, right? I mean, it's not that there's a prioritization, it's that
the individual is still making choices, but making choices in the space of a
Yes.
community that is a given,
Yes.
right? In other words,
Yes.
it's not that, like in early modern Western thought, you have only individuals, and then the question is, how do you assemble those individuals into?
Yes, all you have is Descartes'
groups?
cogito, right?
Right. I
and
mean,
then or there are just cogitos all over the place, so you have to find a way to bring them together in the community, right?
So it seems to me the questions of trust are somewhat different under Ubuntu, but they still exist, right? I mean, they still exist, especially with nation states in modern Africa and so forth. I mean, the kind of classic problem of scaling Ubuntu, right? How do you trust a community when that community comprises millions of people?
Especially given the history of slavery as well, and all that, where communities were implicated in selling slaves and all that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So there's all sorts of reasons to not trust. And so, I could see a place for something like a version of contractarianism within the space of already recognizing that we're embedded within community. I mean, I think that's one thing Ramosa does really interestingly by basically saying, how does religion happen when you make that assumption? How does law happen when you make that assumption? That we're not just assembling it from the abstract ideas, but rather we are in a space that we have to, I almost think of it as a cognitive space rather than a philosophical one. In other words, how do we make it possible so that we can make good philosophical decisions within this real space of other people? And a community that has history to it, and that has all of these things. That's really interesting. That's I think that's a really interesting project.
But I credit you to it because like I said, I mean, when I did the article on Ubuntu and social contract theories, I was only interested in finding features in social contract theory that fits in some aspect of Ubuntu. I wasn't interested in the question of, is there a way you can use contractarianism to try and solve some of the questions that may also be emerging in African ethics. And because you're asking me this question, it's making me to think about that now. And I think, like I said, I'm going to credit you. If I come up with an interesting paper on that, you would get more than a footnote. You'll get a paragraph or a page.
Okay. Well, so I'm now really interested in, I think this is a really interesting question. I'm wondering if there are other questions that you see as being kind of really current and central in ethics in African philosophy today. Like, what is it that I think, or you think needs to be worked out, or is a pressing issue, or I just want to kind of, where's it going? Where's ethics in African philosophy going?
Right. I think there are quite a number of issues, and for time I will see if I focus on just a few. I will mention a few that are important, and then I'll focus on discuss two. So, so you might say discrimination is one very big issue. In ethics, even though sometimes it's discussed in political philosophy, but sometimes the line between moral philosophy and political philosophy get blurred, right? And we see that Gautier actually closed the gap to simply say moral obligations are political obligations, right? And so, but discrimination is a big issue in the light of racism, sexism, people with disabilities, LGBT communities, all kinds of different people who are considered to be in the margins, right? And those are issues that have been with us for long, but they are really heightened because of some events that have happened more recently, perhaps maybe not just with George Floyd, but some other issues that have happened, right? So it's, people really need to begin to think more about what kind of resources we can deploy in ethics to try and help us navigate some of these difficult issues of discrimination in a social and political context. The other one is technology, because of the way which technology is expanding so rapidly, and modern is extended beyond law. Law is usually very late to catch up with technology, and often ethics is actually faster than law. It's actually ahead of law, because law requires a lot of mechanisms to pass it, right? To make it law. But so ethics is interested in this issue of technology, how they affect our identity, for example, how technology, for example, has completely closed the gap. It brought out different kind of communities. So you have all kind of communities today, the invention of internet, for example, whether technology is challenging our notion of community, right? And giving us a set of what communities we should be thinking about communities in different lights, you know, and all that. So there's a whole bunch of different things technology is actually, and you will know quite a bit about this because you do some work in technology, you know, and all that. And ethics is actually still lagging behind a lot. You know, so that's a pressing issue for ethics. Of course, if you want to add to technology, you can add the climate crisis, environmental ethics, which is we are almost at the point of killing ourselves, right? You know, so ethics is there. But I think the one I want to focus on is the issue which really affects not just philosophy in general, but African philosophy. So the issue about it's more of a metaphysical, philosophical, metaethical issue, but it's an issue which has always been there, but it's always will be there, and whether our moral discourse, our moral language, is where does it come from? You know, is it in metaethics? The question would be when you use the word good or just or unjust, what do you mean? Are they referring to facts in a word, you know, or are these subjective experiences of people? So you have the traditional debate of cognitivism and non-cognitivism, you know, giving different answers, or moral realism and moral anti-realism giving different answers, you know, and more recently, someone like Alan Gibbard has made the case, is trying to make a case from Stevenson's idea of emotivism by saying what makes Stevenson's idea of emotivism wrong is because it makes the moral language a product of our emotions. But rather, what we should be saying is that these norms are not expressing our emotions, so to speak, but they are expressing our cultural places, right? They come from a place. And I think that is where the focus should be, is that, so when I say something is good or bad, I am actually drawing on my cultural resources to make that judgment. I'm pushing the whole thing to the culture, right? You know, once you begin to make this sort of move, then you then make a case for intercultural philosophy. You make a case for other philosophical traditions and perspective and canon, because it then means that we cannot understand ethics just by focusing on one tradition or one place. We can understand ethics more if we take into account all the various traditions and places and all that. And then African philosophy then has a lot to also then say in this sort of context.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important, and I would very much agree with that. I mean, I think, you know, the attitude towards ethics in the past has sometimes been that we get our mental architecture straight first in that kind of abstract sense, and then all of the applications. I mean, it's almost a Kantian notion, right? I mean, you know, you get your you know, categorical imperative straight first, and then, you know, then you write your whole critique of practical reason, which is, you know, outside the bounds of pure reason, and it's all about, you know, how this sorts itself out.
Or also in the same way, I mean, we can think of it in terms of what Charles May famously, you know, engage with, which is the conversation or the debate between ID theory and non-ID theory. So the ID theory is a Kantian, you know, a top-down approach. We get all the things at the level, right? The principles, and we abstract them, and then we begin to apply them. Whereas the non-ID simply says, like the idea of Ramos says, to say philosophy is lived experience. It's just embedded in our practices, in our culture, in the way we do things, right? You know, it's non-ID, and after that is bottom up. Then we can build whatever theory from that by looking at how it is actually instantiated in different places and in different contexts.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes so much sense. You know, I think there's been a tendency sometimes, and this is, you know, certainly in Western philosophy, to kick all of that kind of discourse out to, you know, psychology or to anthropology or to literature or to
ethnophilosophy or anthropology.
Whereas I think, you know, these are philosophical moments, and we have to own them. We have to bring them back, you know, and treat them as philosophically important issues. Well, so I want to ask one last question, which is the usual question I kind of wrap up on, which is really kind of in some ways a practical one, which is how you bring new students into African philosophy. I mean, are there people that you tell them to read, or are there books or articles or issues? Like, how do you entice them in? What is it that brings them in?
Right. I think I haven't really had much of a problem in teaching philosophy, African philosophy at VIT, because you have courses that are African philosophy courses there, and students probably have very limited choices, so they do have to take those courses, right?
Right.
So when I came to VIT, I was the one that did introduce or develop the African philosophy modules. Three of them, one at the second year level, and one at the honors level, and one at the master's level. Right. And I've been teaching them since 2014 when they were approved, because I got to VIT 2012, and I introduced them immediately, and they were approved after 2 years. So usually at these levels, students, you have sometimes enough students. Like the second year, some years you will have up to 90, 100 students, right? Right. Who are there, so bringing them in is not so much of an issue, because they already are there. Yeah. The issue is keeping them interested and making them to actually want to do philosophy after they left your class, right? That is really the challenge.
So what's your magic tricks for that? How do you do that?
Yes. So I'll say a bit about that. But there are books and articles that form some of the core of what I do in most of these classes I've had since I've been teaching African philosophy. Right. And some of the books obviously are reference books, because you can't use so many books in a philosophy class. You can't even use one, because sometimes all the chapters don't touch on all the topics you want to cover, right? So but a number of books, and your book is one of them. I do take chapters from your book, because like I said, you are the only person I know who has made that case. I don't know, most people have refused to engage with that idea, but philosophy of place, right? And that if we do more of that, then all of this talk about Western African philosophy, some of these issues will dissolve, I think, So I use some of your chapters. But the other books that I use essays from, Barry Hallam's History of, Short History of African Philosophy, also Masolo's book on African philosophy in search of identity.
That's an excellent book. It's a bit old, but that's an excellent book.
Yes. And then there are chapters also from other anthologies. Say Chukwudi Eze's anthology, which is fantastic, Right. And the Weredu's Companion to African Ethics, as well as the African Philosophy Reader by Kose and Ruse. I use SF all of this. Right. But there are specific articles that I generally recommend to students. I say you read this from the back. So one of them is Eze's African Philosophy and the Analytic Tradition. Yeah. And then also Ish Voigt's article on African philosophy and the metaphysical thesis. I use that as well as an article by Momo in his a chapter from his book, African Philosophy, Substance of African Philosophy. The chapter is titled Nature, Issues and Substance of African Philosophy. The reason I use the article is because those who know Momo, he was my supervisor for my honors project. He is quite, the way he talks is the way he writes. Very funny. He will throw in jokes here. He will throw in some kind of proverbs. He will make joke of them, but something very serious, So it's something you read and you'll be laughing as you get through some of the jokes, but you'll be seeing the point he's making, right? So I get students to read that. I say, if you read these articles, it will give you a kind of an important beginning for African philosophy before we get into some of the meats and nitty-gritty of African philosophy. But so the course, when I structure the course, what I do, I make sure that it is important to have readings that students can have access to. But more important for me, to get students to really like African philosophy, is not so much the readings that they do following that, it's also the project they engage in. So I'll give you an example. So when we hosted the African Philosophy conference in 2015, you were at VIT, you were at the workshop that we did after that.
Right.
2015, yes.
Right.
And we brought in people like Minkiti, Masolo, Ramose was there, Tadmet was there, Barry Hallen was there as keynote speakers and all that. And I got my students in my postgraduate class to participate in the organizing of the conference. You know, so they didn't pay any fees, they participated. I also made sure that these guys, Menkiti came to my class to present a lecture.
That's great.
And for students to question and answer questions about his view on personhood. Barry Hallen also came to my class to talk about his article on Yoruba moral epistemology. Students asked questions and all that. And then I got students to assign them to each talk in the conference to summarize the talk, what is important, what's not important, come to class and present those and all that. So I really got them to engage in the practical aspect of African philosophy, to see African philosophers in action. And what I did was that of all the students I have in that class, I think with the exception of one or two, all of them ended up continuing in African philosophy.
Wow,
Currently, I had 3 students, one of them doing a PhD at Penn State University in African philosophy, another one doing PhD in Germany in African philosophy. My point is that it is good to introduce them to material for them to read, but if you design a course in a way that actually makes them want to, you know, that is why your conversation in African philosophy is very great, because impact will be more than just the text you ask students to read.
Right, exactly.
And I feel that is one very good way for us to draw students and to get them enticed, to get them hooked up, to get them interested to pursue African philosophy going forward. Yeah.
Well, here. I mean, that makes good sense to me. I mean, not everyone is going to be like you, who is just all you needed to do is be exposed to philosophy, and you got it. So, well, thanks so much for giving me some time to chat today. This is really great, and I hope we have another chance soon. And it would be great if it was in person.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And again, congrats and thumbs up for this initiative. And I will be thinking of copying something like that. I would come calling at you to give me all the support and the resources for me to be able to do something like this.
You bet. Always happy to talk.
Thank you very much.
This has been Dr. Edwin Etieyibo in the African Philosophy Conversations. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.